Resuming debate. Reprise de débat. The honourable member for Thornhill.
On the anniversary of Russia's brutal invasion in Ukraine, we're reminded something that should never be controversial in this House. Unchecked tyranny anywhere threatens freedom everywhere. We've seen it in Kiev, we've seen it in Tehran, and increasingly we see it reaching into our own communities here at home. Tyranny doesn't start with tanks. It starts with corruption, with kleptocrats stealing from their own people, with judges who don't serve justice, but instead who serve the dictators who put them there. It starts with silencing women and girls and jailing dissidents and crushing journalists, and then, when no one stops it, it metastasizes. It becomes the brutality of war, and that's the pattern we saw in Moscow, and that's the pattern we're seeing in Tehran, and we've seen in Tehran over the last 47 years. And it's the pattern that this legislation is designed to confront. Nearly a decade ago, Canada made a decision that defined who we are. My colleague in this place from Selkirk, Interlake, Eastman, alongside Senator Anderchuk and many, many other principled advocates close to this place, brought Canada's Sergei Magnitsky law into force. And it was named after a man who exposed corruption and paid for it with his own life. Sergei Magnitsky was tortured to death for telling the truth. His murder was meant to silence others, and instead it gave democracy their most powerful, non-military weapon against modern authoritarians: targeted sanctions that strike kleptocrats and the despots and the dictators where it hurts more: their money, and most importantly, their mobility. Canada acted with moral clarity, but today's threats have evolved, and so too must the country's response. Long before I got elected to this House, I had the privilege of working along colleagues who understand this deeply, including the member from Selkirk, Interlake, Eastman, who has spent more than a decade pushing Canada to take corruption, human rights, and foreign intimidation seriously. When he's in the room, I know that I'm in the right room, and his commitment extends well beyond this House and his time here in it. This legislation builds on his foundations. It strengthens and it modernizes and it sharpens our sanctions regime so it's not symbolic and it's not slow and it's not selective. In other words, it makes it clear and predictable and enforceable. It's because silence protects dictators, while scrutiny, the very thing that we're responsible for here, protects those who are oppressed. A short breakdown, I think, for everybody who's interested to see how as to how this modernization would look. This would require an annual public report on Canada's human rights sanctions and on prisoners of conscience worldwide, including Canadians unjustly detained abroad. There's far more that could be done on that front, but this is a start. In fact, there's been a number of pieces of legislation introduced into this House to look at that issue specifically and rejected wholeheartedly by the government. We have to say this out loud: that sunlight does save lives. It saved the life of Vladimir Kara-Murza, and it did for the two Michaels. And it can do that again. This bill would also formally define and sanction transnational repression, because what once required a secret police crossing borders now requires only a phone, a consulate, a proxy organization operating quietly in our communities, and we know that it's happening. Let's be honest about what that means. Authoritarian regimes in Beijing and Tehran and Moscow and beyond are intimidating, surveying, and harassing and threatening people right here in Canada. Dissidents received midnight calls. Activists are told that their families back home will suffer. Students are followed. Journalists are pressured. This is not an abstract theory. It's happening in Toronto and in Vancouver and in Calgary and right across the country, in Montreal. And as an MP, And I'm not the only one in this house. I've often taken a call from somebody in a car, far away from their house with a blurred out background, whispering because they are terrified that the regime that they ran away from is following them right here in Canada. And if authoritarian states can reach into our cities and hunt their critics, we no longer have full control over the spaces that we claim that are our own. Canada should be a sanctuary for freedom and not a playground for these foreign tyrants, and that's exactly what's happening here. This bill would ensure that when regimes engage in transnational repression on Canadian soil, there is swift, automatic consequences. Freeze their assets, ban the travel, name them publicly, make it unmistakably clear that Canada will not be their hunting ground, and Canadians who ran away from them will not be hunted. We would also close the loophole that allows family members or intimidated family members of sanctioned officials to live in luxury while their relatives jail protesters and siphon money from abroad. No more parking illicit assets here while citizens back home suffer. No more regime activists working out in the local fitness club or eating steaks at Toronto's fanciest restaurant, which we have also seen. We would revoke broadcasting licenses for state-controlled propaganda outlets run by regimes committing atrocities. A regime committing a genocide doesn't deserve a megaphone on Canadian airwaves, and we should support the creation of an international anti-corruption court, because before tyrants become war criminals, they are corrupt officials first. And we know that through every point in history. They steal, and then they repress, and then they wage war. If we confront corruption on the front end, we reduce the atrocities that often follow. I want to spend a few moments on why this matters and who it matters to. The tragedy of PS 752 still weighs heavily on many families in this country. They have waited years for justice and compensation. Frozen regime assets exist, and they should serve the victims and not sit idle. And I know this isn't foundational to families because money doesn't heal the unimaginable loss and the permanent loss that they experience, but it does serve a purpose, and it tells the world that we stand up for our people. Russian sovereign assets frozen in Canada should support Ukraine's fight for survival. And when foreign governments intimidate people on Canadian soil, it's not only a violation of rights, it becomes a test of our own. A test of whether we still believe in moral consequences or whether we have grown too distracted and too divided to draw that very important line. The Cold War had a clarity that many in our era have forgotten. It drew a line clearly between fear and freedom. Today, those lines are less visible, but they're just as real. They run through the phone of a dissident who fled Tehran. They run through the inbox of a Hong Kong activist. They run through the heart of a Ukrainian family who believed that Canada meant safety and now wonder whether the regime that they escaped followed them here. If we don't draw that line, then we teach dictators that Canada could be a welcoming home. And this legislation draws that line clearly. It says Canada will name you, will shame you, will sanction you, and will shut the door on your money and your friends. It says that Canada won't be neutral between those who are jailed and the jailer. And it says something that matters deeply. To Iranian Canadians who marched for Mahsa Amini and those who marched in the hundreds of thousands even in the last week against the genocidal mullahs, to the Ukrainian Canadians watching their homeland defend itself, to the Hong Kong democracy advocates, to the Tibetans, to the Uyghurs, to anyone who came here because Canada represented freedom. It says that we will not allow the dictators you escaped to intimidate you here in Canada. And that's something here that everyone should agree on. I hope this legislation passes. I hope they take it seriously. I hope that it's studied in committee. And I hope the member from Selkirk, Interlake, Eastman is successful in his pursuit of human rights, dignity, and the rule of law like he's always been in this place.